The morning air carried the weight of unfinished business through the courthouse corridors, settling like dust on worn marble floors that had witnessed decades of verdicts, confessions, and heartbreak. Detective Sarah Chen sat in the back row of courtroom 7, her weathered hands folded in her lap, watching as another cold case file was officially closed due to lack of evidence. The victim's family sat 3 rows ahead, their shoulders curved inward like broken wings, their hope finally extinguished after 7 years of waiting for answers that would never come. Beside Sarah's chair, a German shepherd lay with his massive head resting on crossed paws, his amber eyes tracking every movement in the room with the precision that had once made him legendary among the canine units. Rex's muzzle had gone silver over the past 4 years of retirement, but his ears still swiveled toward every whispered conversation, every shuffle of papers, every suppressed sob from the gallery. Even in sleep, his body maintained the coiled readiness of a warrior who had never quite learned to stand down. The judge's gavel echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, and Rex's head lifted immediately, his eyes finding Sarah's face with the intuitive connection that had kept them both alive through 8 years of partnership on the force. She reached down to stroke the soft fur behind his ears, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence, even as another piece of her faith in justice crumbled away. Case dismissed due to insufficient evidence. The judge's voice carried the weariness of a man who had delivered to many similar rulings. The court extends its condolences to the Martinez family. Sarah watched Maria Martinez collapse into her husband's arms, her keening cry cutting through the formal atmosphere like a blade through silk. 7 years ago, their teenage daughter had vanished from a downtown parking garage, leaving behind only a dropped cell phone and security footage, too grainy to reveal the truth. Sarah had worked the case for 3 years before her forced retirement, turning over every stone, following every lead, until the trail went cold as winter concrete. Rex shifted beside her, his massive frame pressing against her leg in the silent communication they had perfected over their years together. He felt her tension, her frustration, the way grief sat like a stone in her chest every time another case slipped through the cracks of an overburdened system. She had trained him to detect explosives, to track fugitives through urban wilderness, to find the evidence that human senses missed, but even Rex couldn't. Resurrect leads that had died in bureaucratic indifference and departmental politics. The courtroom began to empty, lawyers packing their briefcases with the mechanical efficiency of those who would move on to the next tragedy, the next family, the next impossible case. Sarah remained seated, her hand resting on Rex's broad head, both of them veterans of a war that never truly ended. She thought about the box of unsolved files in her home office, the faces that haunted her dreams, the families who still called her personal number hoping for miracles she couldn't deliver. Detective Chen, a voice interrupted her reverie. She looked up to see Detective Luis Rodriguez approaching, his young face carrying the earnest determination she recognized from her own early years on the force. "I wanted to thank you for all your work on the Martinez case. I know how hard you fought for them." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Rex had risen to his feet, his posture shifting into the alert stance that meant he was reading the emotional undercurrents in the room. His dark eyes moved between Sarah and Rodriguez, cataloging stress levels, heart rate changes, the microscopic tells that humans missed but dogs never did. "Sometimes the system fails them," Sarah finally managed, her voice carrying the rough edge of someone who had seen too much and saved too few. "Sometimes we fail them." Rodriguez knelt beside Rex, extending his hand for the dog to sniff. Rex allowed the contact, but remained vigilant, his loyalty belonging entirely to Sarah, even after 4 years away from active duty. "I've read your files," Rodriguez said. "Every case you and Rex worked together. Your clearance rate was unprecedented." The compliment sat uneasily on Sarah's shoulders. Statistics meant nothing to Maria Martinez, whose daughter's room remained exactly as she had left it 7 years ago. Numbers couldn't explain away the cases that slipped through their fingers, the evidence that disappeared, the witnesses who vanished into the night. Outside the courthouse, the October afternoon had turned gray and bitter, matching Sarah's mood. As she walked beside Rex through the parking garage where another family's nightmare had begun, Rex paused suddenly, his head tilting as his ears caught a sound just beyond human hearing. His body went rigid, every muscle coiled with attention, and Sarah felt the familiar electricity of his alertness travel up the leash. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, following his gaze toward a maintenance area near the back corner of the garage. For a moment, she thought she saw movement in the shadows, but when she blinked, there was nothing but empty concrete and the echo of her own heartbeat. Rex whined low in his throat, a sound she had learned to interpret as frustration mixed with something deeper, recognition that eluded words but demanded attention. Something was wrong here, something that connected to memories buried in muscle and instinct, waiting for the right moment to surface. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. A security guard emerged from the stairwell, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his eyes avoiding direct contact as he approached. "Everything okay out here, Detective?" Sarah studied his face, noting the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from him like heat. Rex had begun to pant slightly, his tongue lolling out in what might have appeared to be casual dog behavior, but which Sarah recognized as barely contained excitement. Something about this guard, this place, this moment was triggering responses in her partner that she hadn't seen since their last active case. "Just leaving," she replied carefully, but Rex had other ideas. The German Shepherd pulled toward the maintenance area with sudden insistence, his powerful shoulders straining against the leash as a low growl vibrated in his chest. Whatever he sensed in those shadows, it was significant enough to break through. For years of retirement conditioning, the security guard's hand moved instinctively toward his radio. A motion so quick, Sarah almost missed it. But Rex didn't miss anything. His growl deepened, harmonizing with the fluorescent lights that hummed overhead, like a warning only he could properly interpret. The apartment Sarah shared with Rex sat 3 miles from downtown, in a neighborhood that had seen better decades, but still maintained the quiet dignity of working-class resilience. Red brick buildings lined streets where children played until darkness fell, and where neighbors still looked out for each other, with the unspoken solidarity of people who understood that safety was something you built together. One relationship at a time, Rex had adapted to retirement better than Sarah had expected, though she sometimes caught him staring out the front window with the intensity of a soldier still waiting for orders that would never come. His internal clock remained military precise: wake at 0500, breakfast at 0530, morning walk at 0600, as if the routine itself might summon back the purpose that had defined them both for nearly a decade. Sarah poured coffee from a pot that had witnessed more sleepless nights than she cared to count, her kitchen walls decorated with commendations and photographs that told the story of their partnership. Rex receiving his certification as a bomb detection specialist, Sarah's promotion to detective, both of them standing beside a recovered kidnapping victim whose smile had made all the bureaucratic battles worthwhile. Pictures of cases solved, families reunited, justice served in increments that added up to something like meaning. But the wall also held reminders of their limitations. A newspaper clipping about the Martinez case, yellow with age and frustration. A letter from the parents of a missing college student whose disappearance had consumed 6 months of their lives before. The trail went cold. Photos of crime scenes that yielded no secrets, evidence bags that contained no answers, suspects who vanished into the bureaucratic maze of an overburdened system. Rex appeared in the kitchen doorway, his routine as predictable as sunrise. Morning patrol of the apartment perimeter, checking windows and doors with the thoroughness of someone who had never quite accepted that the war was over. His amber eyes met Sarah's, and she saw in them the same restlessness that kept her awake some nights, staring at the ceiling and wondering if they had done enough, saved enough, mattered enough to justify the weight of their failures. "I know, boy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears in the spot that never failed to make his tail wag. "I miss it too." The truth was more complicated than simple nostalgia. Sarah missed the clarity of active duty, the sense that each day might bring answers, that their combined skills might tip the balance toward justice for someone who desperately needed it. Retirement had given them financial security and peaceful mornings, but it had also severed the lifeline that connected their daily existence to something larger than themselves. Rex had been 3 years old when they were partnered, a young dog, with intelligence that bordered on supernatural, and an eye that matched Sarah's own obsessive pursuit of truth. She had been coming off a difficult divorce, throwing herself into work, with the desperation of someone who needed to prove that some partnerships could survive anything. Rex had been recovering from the loss of his first handler, killed in the line of duty, his trust in humans shattered but not destroyed. They had rebuilt each other through shared missions that tested every limit they thought they had. Bomb threats in elementary schools where Rex's nose detected explosive residue, invisible to every sophisticated scanner the department owned. Missing persons cases where his tracking abilities led them through urban labyrinths that would have confounded GPS systems. Drug operations where his detection skills proved the difference between conviction and acquittal, between families destroyed and communities protected. The partnership had cost them both. Sarah's social life had withered as she poured herself into cases that followed them home, into dreams populated by faces of victims they couldn't save. Rex had absorbed her intensity, her drive, until he vibrated with energy, even during downtime, always ready for the next call that would demand everything they had to give. The department psychologist had called it codependency. Sarah preferred to think of it as evolution to separate beings becoming something more effective together than either could be alone. Rex learned to read her moods with uncanny precision, adjusting his energy to match her needs. Sarah learned to interpret his body language with the fluency of a translator, understanding when his alertness meant danger and when it meant curiosity, when his stillness indicated focus and when it suggested concern. Their forced retirement had come after a case that nearly destroyed them both, a kidnapping that led them into abandoned industrial tunnels beneath the city, where Rex had detected not just the missing child, but also an improvised explosive device designed to eliminate anyone who came looking. The blast had thrown them both against concrete walls, leaving Sarah with a concussion that ended her active career, and Rex with a limp that still appeared during cold mornings. But they had saved the child, and sometimes that knowledge was enough to balance the scales of regret that weighed on quiet afternoons when the world seemed content to function without their particular brand of desperate competence. Sarah's phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, displaying a number she didn't recognize. Rex's ears perked up at the sound, his body shifting into alert mode as she answered. Detective Chen's voice was young, female, shaking with the controlled emotion of someone trying not to break down. "My name is Jessica Martinez. Maria Martinez was my aunt. I know the case was closed yesterday, but I found something I think you need to see." Rex was on his feet now, his amber eyes locked on Sarah's face, as he read the tension that automatically surfaced whenever the past reached forward to reclaim them. Some instinct told him this call mattered, that the quiet morning was about to become something else entirely. "What did you find?" Sarah asked, though part of her wanted to hang up, to protect the fragile peace they had built in retirement. "Photos." Jessica's voice cracked. "From the security guard who worked the garage, where Carmen disappeared. He died last week, and I am cleaning out his apartment. There are photos, detective, photos of my cousin and other girls. Photos he wasn't supposed to have." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar electricity of a case pulling her back into the current of purpose and danger that had defined so much of their lives. Rex whined softly, his tail wagging with anticipation, his body already responding to the change in her energy. The dead security guard's name had been William Mason, and Sarah remembered him, now the nervous man from the parking garage yesterday, whose hand had moved toward his radio when Rex showed interest in the maintenance area. But William Mason had died 3 days ago of a heart attack, which meant the man they had encountered was someone else entirely, someone who had access to Mason's uniform and his post. Rex stretched, his muscles rippling beneath his coat as he prepared for whatever came next. For years of retirement had been peaceful, but peace had never been their natural element. They were creatures of purpose, forged in the crucible of other people's worst moments, and somewhere in the city, another family was waiting for answers that only they might be able to provide. The trash can sat innocuously beside the bench in Riverside Park, one of dozens scattered throughout the recreation area that had become Sarah's preferred route for Rex's afternoon walks. The October afternoon had turned crisp with the promise of winter, and maple leaves crunched beneath their feet as they followed the familiar path along the creek that gave the park its name. Rex trotted beside her with the easy gait of a dog who had made peace with routine, his nose cataloguing the thousands of scents that painted an invisible map of the neighborhood's daily rhythms. Sarah's mind remained fixed on Jessica Martinez's phone call from 2 days earlier. The photos Jessica had found in the dead security guard's apartment were disturbing but inconclusively on Grange. Surveillance shots of young women in parking garages and shopping centers, including several pictures of Carmen Martinez from the weeks before her disappearance. The police had reopened the investigation, But with William Mason dead, and no clear connection to Carmen's abduction, the case remained frustratingly elusive. Rex had been unusually restless since the phone call, his sleep interrupted by dreams that made him whimper and twitch his legs, as if running through scenarios only he could see. Sarah recognized the signs her partner's subconscious was working through, puzzle pieces that hadn't yet assembled into coherent understanding. The same process that had made him legendary for detecting evidence that human investigators missed. They were passing the row of benches near the playground when Rex stopped abruptly, his head tilting with the intensity that always preceded significant discoveries, his amber eyes fixed on the metal trash can beside the third bench, his nostrils flaring as he tested the air currents with the precision of a scientist analyzing molecular compounds. "What is it, boy?" Sarah asked, but Rex was already moving, his powerful frame pulling her toward the trash can with purpose that seemed to emerge from muscle memory rather than conscious thought. His breathing had quickened, and she could see the tension building in his shoulders as whatever sense signature he was following grew stronger. Rex began to scratch at the base of the trash can with his front paws, his claws scoring the metal with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. The behavior was specific, focused, identical to the alerting technique he had used during their active years when detecting explosive devices or hidden contraband. Sarah felt her own heart rate accelerate as she recognized the signs. Rex wasn't just curious or playful, he was working. "Easy, Rex, easy," she murmured, scanning the park for other visitors who might observe their investigation. A jogger passed on the far side of the creek, earbuds blocking out the world. A mother pushed her toddler on the swing set 50 yards away, too absorbed in her child's laughter to notice the retired canine team conducting what appeared to be an unofficial search operation. Rex's scratching intensified, his whines becoming more urgent as he tried to communicate something that existed beyond the reach of human vocabulary. Sarah knelt beside the trash can, examining its base for anything unusual. The metal container appeared standard, recently emptied, showing no obvious signs of tampering or damage. But Rex's behavior was too specific to ignore, too purposeful to dismiss as random dog curiosity. She pulled a pair of latex gloves from her jacket poquita habit that had survived for years of retirement and began to examine the trash can more systematically. The bottom edge was secured with metal brackets that showed slight scratches, as if someone had recently removed and replaced them. Rex whined again, his tail wagging with the excitement of a dog who knew his human was finally understanding the message he had been trying to convey. Using her car key as a makeshift tool, Sarah worked at the brackets until they loosened enough to reveal a gap between the trash can's bottom and its base. Rex's excitement reached fever pitch as she created an opening large enough to insert her hand. Her fingers encountered something plastic, something that didn't belong in the mechanical workings of a park maintenance container. The plastic bag was small, carefully sealed, containing what appeared to be jewelry and personal items. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized a silver bracelet with a distinctive butterfly charmer piece she had seen in dozens of photos during the Martinez investigation. Carmen's mother had described the bracelet in heartbreaking detail, a Quinceañera gift that her daughter had worn every day since her 15th birthday. Rex sat beside her, his tongue lolling out in satisfaction as he watched Sarah examine the contents of the bag. More jewelry emerged: class ring, a pair of earrings, a necklace with a small cross pendant. Each piece represented someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone whose disappearance had created a wound in the fabric of family and community that might never fully heal. At the bottom of the bag, Sarah found a folded piece of paper, yellow with age and handling. Her hand shook slightly as she unfolded it, revealing a list written in careful block letters: names, dates, locations. Carmen Martinez appeared third on the list, with the notation ripped 10/15 beside her entry. Below Carmen's name were 7 more entries, the most recent dated just 2 weeks ago. A shadow fell across the paper, and Sarah looked up to see a figure approaching from the direction of the park entrance. The man wore a maintenance worker's uniform, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Rex's posture shifted immediately from satisfaction to alertness, his hackles rising as he positioned himself between Sarah and the approaching stranger. "Find something interesting?" the man asked, his voice carrying a casual friendliness that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah recognized him now, the same person who had been wearing William Mason's security uniform in the parking garage 2 days earlier, the one whose nervous energy had triggered Rex's suspicion. Rex's growl was low and continuous now, a warning that vibrated through the ground beneath Sarah's knees. Every muscle in the German Shepherd's body was coiled for action, his amber eyes fixed on the stranger with the intensity of a predator who had identified a threat to his pack. "Just cleaning up some litter," Sarah replied carefully, her hand moving instinctively toward the phone in her jacket pocket. But the man was close enough now to see the evidence bag, close enough to understand that his carefully constructed secret was dissolving in the October afternoon light. Rex's warning growl deepened as the man's hand moved toward something concealed beneath his maintenance jacket. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, 4 years of retirement evaporating as she prepared for the confrontation she had hoped would never come. Her partner was ready beside her, waiting for the signal that would release 8 years of accumulated expertise into whatever violence the moment might require. The peaceful afternoon had become a crime scene, and somewhere in the back of her mind, Sarah realized that retirement had been nothing more than an intermission in a story that was far from finished. The man, calling himself David Morrison, had been collecting trophies for 8 years, and his carefully maintained facade was crumbling with each passing second as Sarah Chen knelt beside the trash can that contained evidence of his methodical predation. Rex maintained his protective stance, every fiber of his being focused on the threat that approached with false casualness, wearing a maintenance uniform that provided perfect camouflage for someone who needed access to public spaces where young women might be vulnerable. Morrison's hand hovered near his jacket pocket, and Sarah recognized the body language of someone weighing violent options against the possibility of escape. Rex sensed the escalating danger, his growl dropping into the subsonic range that made Morrison instinctively step backward. The German Shepherd had dealt with armed suspects before, and his positioning indicated he was prepared to neutralize the threat with the same efficiency that had once made him legendary among canine units. "I know who you are," Sarah said quietly, rising slowly from her crouched position while keeping her eyes locked on Morrison's face. "William Mason was your partner, wasn't he? The security guard who died last week. He took the photos, but you were the one who took the girls." Morrison's laugh carried no humor, only the brittle edge of someone whose carefully constructed world was disintegrating in real time. "Mason was weak. Started getting nervous after the Martinez girl wanted to stop. Said we were pushing our luck." His hand moved closer to his jacket pocket, and Rex's muscles coiled like loaded springs. "Had to help him have that heart attack. Amazing what a little potassium chloride can accomplish when injected properly." The confession hit Sarah like a physical blow, not just for its casual admission of murder, but for the implications it carried. If Morrison had killed his partner to maintain operational security, he would have no hesitation about eliminating a retired detective and her dog, who had accidentally uncovered his trophy cache. The bag of jewelry in her hand represented years of careful planning, systematic hunting, families destroyed by someone who viewed other human beings as collectible objects. Rex took a step forward, his amber eyes never leaving Morrison's face. As he calculated distance, angle of attack, the physics of bringing down a threat that had already demonstrated willingness to kill, Sarah could feel the tension radiating from her partner's body, the same deadly focus that had saved her life multiple times during their active years, when split-second decisions meant the difference between going home and being carried out. "The Martinez family deserves to know what happened to Carmen," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Her mother has been living in hell for 7 years, not knowing if her daughter is alive or dead. These are the families, they need closure." Morrison's expression shifted, and Sarah saw something cold and calculating behind his eyes that made her understand this conversation was merely a prelude to violence. He had maintained his secret for 8 years through meticulous planning and casual brutality, and he wouldn't allow it to be destroyed by a chance encounter with a retired canine team whose afternoon walk had intersected with his carefully hidden depravity. "Nobody needs to know anything," Morrison said, his hand finally moving toward his jacket. "This can all just disappear. You, the dog, the evidence. Industrial accidents happen all the time." Rex exploded into motion before Morrison's weapon cleared. His jacket, 85 pounds of trained aggression covering the distance between them in less than 2 seconds. Morrison's gun discharged into the air as Rex's teeth found his wrist. The German Shepherd's bite force crushing bones with audible snaps while Sarah rolled behind the bench and pulled out her phone to call for backup. The struggle lasted only moments. Morrison's screams echoed across the park as Rex applied the precise techniques he had learned for subduing armed suspects. His jaws locked around the gunman's wrist while his powerful body dragged Morrison to the ground. Sarah shouted commands that Rex executed with mechanical precision, releasing Morrison's wrist only to secure his throat in a hold that made further resistance impossible. When police sirens began to wail in the distance, Morrison's face had gone grey with shock and blood loss, but he was alive. Rex sat beside his subdued target, tongue lolling out in satisfaction, his tail wagging slightly as he looked to Sarah for the praise that always followed successful completion of a mission. Even for years into retirement, some training remained muscle memory. Some partnerships transcended the boundaries of active duty. Sarah knelt beside Rex, scratching behind his ears while emergency responders flooded the park. "Good boy," she whispered. "Good boy, you found them all." The evidence bag containing Carmen Martinez's bracelet sat beside the bench, along with the handwritten list that would finally provide answers to families who had been searching for daughters, sisters, friends who had vanished into the predatory darkness that people like Morrison created in the spaces between normal life and unthinkable evil. Rex had detected what human investigation had missed, his nose leading them to justice that had been literally buried beneath the surface of ordinary municipal infrastructure. Detective Rodriguez arrived with the first wave of responders, his young face showing the same mixture of horror and determination that Sarah remembered from her own early cases. She handed him the evidence bag and Morrison's confession list, watching him process the magnitude of what Rex had uncovered with a simple afternoon alert to an innocuous trash can. "How did he know?" Rodriguez asked, looking at Rex with something approaching reverence. "How did he know to scratch there?" Sarah looked at her partner, whose amber eyes reflected the satisfaction of purpose fulfilled, of skills applied to their intended function even after years of dormancy. "He remembered the scent," she said, "from the parking garage 2 days ago. When we met the fake security guard, Rex associated Morrison's smell with something wrong, something that needed investigation. He's been working the case in his head ever since." Morrison was loaded into an ambulance under heavy guard, his wrist wrapped in bandages, but his future measured in consecutive life sentences that would ensure he never had the opportunity to add more names to his collection list. Sarah watched the ambulance disappear down the park road, carrying away the man who had turned the simple act of parking a car or walking alone into potential tragedy for families across the city. Rex leaned against her leg, his massive head resting against her hip in the gesture of companionship that had sustained them, both through 8 years of partnership and 4 years of retirement. Tomorrow would bring media attention, legal proceedings, the bureaucratic machinery of justice grinding forward to process another case solved by the intuitive partnership between human determination and canine instinct. But tonight would be quiet, peaceful, an evening spent in the apartment they shared with the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, even in retirement, the skills that defined them could still tip the balance toward justice for families who had been waiting years for answers that finally had a chance to emerge from the darkness. The interrogation room at police headquarters had been Sarah's second home during her active years, and returning to it felt like stepping back into a life that had never quite fit properly into the past tense. Morrison sat shackled to the metal table, his bandaged wrist a testament to Rex's efficiency in subduing armed suspects, his face carrying the sullen resentment of someone whose carefully constructed fantasy had been demolished by forces beyond his control. Sarah sat across from him with Detective Rodriguez, while Rex lay in the corner with his head on his paws, monitoring the proceedings with the patient attention of a professional who understood that some work required stillness rather than action. The evidence recovered from the park trash can was spread across the table: jewelry, photographs, the handwritten list that had become a roadmap to 8 years of systematic predation. "Tell us about Carmen Martinez," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who had seen too many crime scene photos, interviewed too many grieving families who would never be whole again. "What happened to her?" Morris, lawyer, a public defender who looked like she wished she were anywhere else, advised her client to remain silent. But Morrison seemed compelled to speak. as if the secret he had guarded for so long needed to be shared, now that its power to protect him had evaporated. Sarah recognized the psychology. Some killers couldn't resist the opportunity to demonstrate their superiority, their cleverness, even when confession guaranteed their destruction. She fought more than the others, Morrison said, his eyes fixed on Carmen's bracelet. Most of them were so scared they just froze, but she kicked and screamed and tried to run. Had to hit her harder than I wanted to. His voice carried no remorse, only the clinical detachment of someone discussing a mechanical problem that had required additional force to solve. Rex's ears flicked forward at the change in Morrison's tone, his amber eyes tracking the subtle shifts in posture and breathing that indicated increasing emotional investment in the narrative. Sarah had seen this pattern before. Suspects who became animated when describing their crimes, who derived satisfaction from reliving moments of power and control over victims who could no longer resist or escape. "Where did you take her?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral, despite the rage building in her chest. Carmen had been 17 years old, planning to study nursing, devoted to her family and her church. She had become a collection object for someone who viewed other human beings as trophies to be acquired and discarded. Morrison smiled, an expression that made Rex growl low in his throat. The old Riverside industrial complex, plenty of empty buildings, soundproof basements, places where nobody goes looking. Mason had keys from his security company, could disable alarms and cameras. He leaned forward slightly, savoring the attention, kept them there for weeks sometimes, until I got bored. The industrial complex had been abandoned for 15 years, a sprawling maze of empty factories and warehouses that the city had been trying to redevelop without success. Sarah had driven past it thousands of times during her active years, never suspecting that it harbored the kind of evil that populated parents' worst nightmares. Morrison and Mason had found the perfect hunting ground, isolated, accessible, forgotten by everyone except the predators who needed places where screams wouldn't carry beyond concrete walls. "How many?" Rodriguez asked, though the evidence suggested they already knew the answer. The list contained 11 names spanning 8 years, young women who had disappeared from parking garages, shopping centers, college campuses, women whose families had organized search parties, hired private investigators, never stopped hoping for phone calls that would never come. "Started slow," Morrison admitted, his voice taking on the nostalgic tone of someone remembering better times. "Mason was nervous at first, thought we should stick to peeping, following them home, taking pictures, but watching wasn't enough after a while. Had to have more." Sarah felt sick listening to the casual progression from voyeurism to kidnapping to murder. The way Morrison described escalating violence as if it were a natural evolution rather than a series of choices to destroy other people's lives for his own entertainment. Rex seemed to sense her distress, lifting his head to meet her eyes with a steady gaze that had anchored her through countless difficult cases. The interview continued for 3 hours, with Morrison providing details that would help close missing persons cases across 2 states. His cooperation wasn't motivated by remorse or desire for redemption, but by the narcissistic pleasure of demonstrating his cleverness, his ability to evade detection for nearly a decade while maintaining the facade of a normal maintenance worker who blended invisibly into urban landscapes. When they finally returned Morrison to his cell, Sarah felt emotionally drained in a way that retirement had almost allowed her to forget. Rex trotted beside her through the police station corridors, his tail wagging slightly as he absorbed praise from officers who recognized him from his legendary active years. But Sarah could see the toll the day had taken on her partner as well. The way his ears drooped slightly, the careful placement of his paws that indicated the old injury from their final case, was bothering him again. Outside the station, Detective Rodriguez caught up with them in the parking lot. "The families want to meet you," he said. "All of them. They want to thank you and Rex for finally giving them answers." Sarah nodded, though part of her dreaded the meetings that would follow. Gratitude was complicated when it came wrapped in grief that could never be fully resolved, when closure meant confirming parents' worst fears about daughters who would never come home. Rex would handle the emotional weight better than she would. Dogs understood suffering without being crushed by it, offered comfort without absorbing trauma that belonged to other people. The October evening had turned cold, and Sarah pulled her jacket tighter as they walked to her car. Rex jumped into the passenger seat with less agility than he had shown in his prime. his age and old injuries finally beginning to assert themselves after a day that had demanded everything his body and mind could provide. But his tail was still wagging, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of purpose fulfilled, of skills applied to their intended function, even after years of dormancy. As Sarah started the engine, she realized that retirement had been nothing more than an intermission in a story that would continue as long as her partner's nose could detect truth buried beneath layers of deception and carefully maintained facades. Morrison was captured, but there would be other predators who counted on human blindness to the evil that moved through ordinary spaces disguised as maintenance workers, security guards, helpful strangers who offered assistance that became imprisonment. Rex rested his head against the window as they drove home, his breathing settling into the rhythm of a working dog who had completed his mission successfully. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more families, more evidence to process, but tonight belonged to them, to the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, even years after official retirement, the partnership between human determination and canine instinct could still tip the balance toward justice for those who had been waiting too long for answers that finally had a chance to emerge from the darkness. The Riverside industrial complex stretched across 40 acres of abandoned dreams, its empty factories and warehouses standing like tombstones marking the death of an economic era that had provided jobs and purpose for 3 generations of working families. Sarah and Rex arrived with the Dawn tactical team, their breath visible in the October morning air, as they prepared to search buildings that had become Morrison's private hunting preserve over 8 years of methodical predation. Rex moved with renewed purpose as they approached the main entrance, his nose working the air currents that carried information invisible to human senses, but rich with meaning for a dog whose training had never truly been retired. The complex smelled of rust, decay, and something else, something organic and wrong that made Rex's hackles rise as he strained against his leash with urgency that communicated itself directly to Sarah's nervous system. Detective Rodriguez led the search team, his young face grim with the knowledge of what they expected to find in the basement levels where Morrison had admitted keeping his victims before their voices were permanently silenced. The industrial buildings had been constructed with soundproof walls designed to contain manufacturing noise, making them perfect isolation chambers for someone who needed space to operate without interference from outside authorities. Sarah followed Rex as he led them toward Building C, a 3-story structure that had once housed textile machinery but had been empty for 15 years. Rex's body language was specific, focused, identical to the alerting behavior that had made him legendary during their active years. His tail was rigid, his ears forward, his entire being concentrated on scent signatures that painted an invisible map of the complex's hidden history. The building's interior was a maze of empty rooms, connected by corridors that echoed with their footsteps, creating an acoustic environment where sound seemed to bounce off concrete walls and disappear into darkness that had swallowed too many screams over the years. Rex pulled toward a stairwell leading to the basement level, his whines becoming more urgent as whatever he was tracking grew stronger. The basement had been divided into smaller rooms, each equipped with makeshift restraints that spoke to a more methodical approach to imprisoning victims who had committed no crime except being young, female, and vulnerable in spaces where predators could operate without detection. Rex moved from room to room, his nose cataloging evidence that would help forensic teams reconstruct 8 years of systematic torture and murder. In the final room, Rex stopped beside what appeared to be a concrete wall that had been recently repowered, his scratching behavior identical to what he had displayed at the park trash can. Sarah knelt beside him, running her hands along the wall's surface until she found slight variations in texture that suggested newer concrete had been poured over something that Morrison had wanted to remain permanently hidden. The forensic team arrived with ground-penetrating radar and concrete cutting equipment, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to the emotional weight of what they expected to uncover. Rex sat beside Sarah as the machinery began its methodical destruction of Morrison's final secret, his amber eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a job completed, despite the horror of what that completion would reveal. The first body they found was Carmen Martinez, her remains carefully wrapped in plastic sheeting that had preserved enough evidence to confirm her identity through dental records. Sarah watched Maria Martinez, collapse into her husband's arms when the medical examiner delivered the news that ended 7 years of hoping against hope that their daughter might somehow still be alive somewhere, somehow finding her way home. Rex remained steady throughout the excavation process, his presence providing comfort to family members who had come to witness the final chapter of their loved ones' stories. The German Shepherd seemed to understand that his role had expanded beyond detection to emotional support, allowing grieving parents to bury their faces in his fur while they processed news that brought closure at the cost of confirming their worst fears. 10 more bodies emerged from Morrison's concrete tomb over 3 days of careful excavation, each one representing someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone whose absence had created wounds in families that would never fully heal. The youngest victim had been 16, the oldest 22, all of them sharing the tragic commonality of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. When Morrison's hunting instincts had identified them as potential acquisitions for his collection, Sarah found herself thinking about the randomness of predation, the way evil moved through ordinary spaces disguised as helpful maintenance workers, friendly security guards, concerned strangers who offered assistance that became imprisonment. Morrison had selected his victims based on opportunity rather than personal connection, making their deaths feel even more senseless, more preventable, more tragic in their arbitrary cruelty. The media attention that followed the discoveries was intense but mercifully brief, focusing more on the successful resolution of multiple cold cases than on the gruesome details of how those cases had been created. Sarah and Rex found themselves interviewed by reporters who wanted to understand how a retired canine team had accomplished what active investigators had been unable to achieve for 8 years. Rex never really retired, Sarah told them. He just needed the right case, the right moment, the right scent to remind him that his training was still relevant, still needed. She looked at her partner, who lay at her feet with the patient dignity of a working dog who understood that some stories were too important to remain buried beneath concrete and bureaucratic indifference. The final piece of Morrison's operation was discovered when forensic accountants traced financial records that revealed a network of buyers who had paid premium prices for photographs and videos of his victims' captivity. The investigation expanded to include federal charges that would ensure Morrison never saw freedom again, while also identifying customers whose own crimes had created the market demand that made his predation profitable. Sarah watched from the courthouse gallery as Morrison was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, his face showing no remorse as families of his victims delivered impact statements that painted portraits of lives cut short by his narcissistic need to possess and control other human beings. Rex lay beside her chair, his grey muzzle resting on crossed paws, his amber eyes tracking the proceedings with the same attention he had given to active crime scenes during their partnership. When the judge's final gavel fell, Sarah felt a complex, the mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that she recognized from their active years, the sense that justice had been served, but at a cost that extended far beyond the courtroom, into families that would spend the rest of their lives learning to live with answers they had needed but never wanted to receive. Outside the courthouse, Rodriguez caught up with them in the parking lot. "The department wants to offer you a consulting position," he said. "Cold cases, missing persons, anything where Rex's nose might make the difference. Part-time, your own schedule, but official enough to give you access to resources." Sarah looked at Rex, who was watching a group of children playing in a nearby park with the alert interest that had never quite faded despite 4 years of retirement. Her partner's tail wagged slightly as he absorbed the sounds of laughter, a normal childhood that Morrison's victims had been denied, their futures erased by someone who viewed other people as collectible objects, rather than human beings deserving of life and happiness. "We'll think about it," Sarah replied, though she already knew the answer. Rex had tasted purpose again, felt the satisfaction of skills applied to their intended function, and retirement had revealed itself to be nothing more than an intermission in a story that would continue as long as families needed answers and his nose could detect truth buried beneath layers of deception and carefully maintained facades. The October afternoon was turning cold as they walked to their car, but Sarah felt warmer than she had in months. Rex jumped into the passenger seat with surprising agility, his eyes bright with anticipation, as if he already knew that tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to tip the balance. toward justice for those who had been waiting too long for someone to care enough to keep searching. As they drove home through streets that held countless secrets, Sarah realized that the most important discovery had been learning that some partnerships transcend the boundaries of active duty, some training remains muscle memory even after years of dormancy, and sometimes the most ordinary moments, walking past a trash can in a neighborhood park, can become the beginning of justice for families who had given up hope that anyone was still looking for answers that finally had a chance to emerge from the darkness. 6 months after Morrison's conviction, Sarah Chen stood in her kitchen at 0500, pouring coffee from the same pot that had witnessed more sleepless nights than she cared to count. But the darkness outside her window no longer felt like an ending. Rex appeared in the doorway with military precision, his routine unchanged despite the transformation that had returned purpose to both their lives when the department had officially reinstated them as a cold case. Consultation team. The walls still held photographs from their active years, but new additions had appeared: letters from families whose cases Rex had helped solve, commendations from agencies across 3 states who had requested their assistance, newspaper clippings about missing persons, investigations that had been resolved through the partnership between human determination and canine instinct that had never truly been retired. Rex padded to his food bowl with the satisfied gait of a working dog whose skills were once again being applied to their intended function. His gray muzzle might betray his age, but his amber eyes remained sharp with intelligence that had adapted to new challenges. While drawing on 8 years of accumulated expertise, the old injury from their final active case still bothered him on cold mornings. But purpose had proven to be better medicine than rest for a dog, whose identity was inseparable from the work that gave meaning to otherwise ordinary days. Sarah's phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, displaying Detective Rodriguez's number. 6 months of collaboration had taught her to recognize the difference between routine check-ins and calls that would disrupt whatever plans they might have made, for quiet mornings spent in peaceful retirement that no longer fit their definition of fulfillment. "We've got one," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone who had learned to appreciate the unique capabilities that Rex brought to investigations that had stalled despite every conventional approach. "Missing college student, disappeared 3 weeks ago from campus. Local PD has exhausted their leads, but there's something about the case that feels familiar." Rex was already on his feet, his body language shifting from relaxed domesticity to alert readiness as he read. The change in Sarah's energy that always preceded their deployment to scenes where someone's worst day had become a family's permanent nightmare. His tail wagged with anticipation, not for the tragedy they would encounter, but for the opportunity to apply skills that had been honed through years of partnership to help families who were still hoping for answers that might tip the balance between despair and closure. "We'll be there in an hour," Sarah replied, already reaching for the equipment bag that lived beside the front door. Always packed and ready for cases that demanded immediate response. Rex trotted beside her as she gathered keys, phone, the latex gloves that had become second nature, the treats that served as reward for successful completion of missions that never felt routine despite their frequency. The university campus was 40 miles north of the city, surrounded by the kind of rolling hills and mature trees that created an atmosphere of academic serenity, designed to help young people focus on learning, rather than the predators who moved through even the most carefully maintained environments. Sarah and Rex arrived as the morning sun was burning off. October fog that clung to buildings like secrets waiting to be revealed. By the right combination of persistence and professional expertise, Detective Lisa Chunyo relation, despite the shared surname, met them at the campus security office with files that documented 3 weeks of investigation that had produced no meaningful leads despite extensive interviews, exhaustive searches, and media coverage that had generated hundreds of tips leading nowhere. The missing student was Amy Foster, 20 years old, studying elementary education. Last seen leaving the library at 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night that had become the dividing line between normal college life and the kind of family nightmare that transformed loving parents into desperate investigators who spent sleepless nights calling every hospital within a 100-mile radius. Rex explored the security office while the detectives reviewed case details, his nose cataloging the accumulated stress and frustration that had permeated the space, where too many people had worked too many hours trying to solve a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. His ears perked up when Detective Chen mentioned that Amy's disappearance was the third in 18 months within a 50-mile radius of similar campuses, all involving young women who had vanished without trace, despite sophisticated security systems and extensive search efforts. "Show me where she was last seen," Sarah said, following Detective Chen across campus toward the library. That had become the starting point for an investigation that had consumed local resources without producing answers. Rex trotted beside them, his attention divided between environmental awareness and the more focused sampling of air currents that carried information invisible to human senses, but rich with meaning for a dog whose training included the ability to detect scent signatures hours or even days after they had been deposited. The library parking lot appeared normal, unremarkable, the kind of well-lit space that should have provided safety for students returning to dormitories after long evenings spent studying for exams that no longer mattered to Amy Foster's family. Rex began working the area methodically, his nose painting an invisible map of who had been present when they had arrived, what emotional states had accompanied their movements through space that held no secrets from someone trained to read. The molecular traces that humans left behind without conscious awareness. Near the southeast corner of the parking lot, Rex stopped abruptly, his head tilting with the intensity that always preceded significant discoveries. His nostrils flared as he tested air currents that carried scent signatures connecting present investigation to memories buried in muscle and instinct, waiting for the right moment to surface and transform routine consultation into active pursuit of justice for families who had been waiting too long for someone to care enough to keep searching for answers that finally had a chance to emerge from carefully maintained facades of normalcy. Sarah knelt beside her partner, watching his body language shift into the alert stance that meant he was tracking something significant, something that connected Amy Foster's disappearance to patterns only he could detect, through senses that had never accepted retirement as a permanent condition. The October morning was crisp with the promise of revelations that would test everything they had learned about the persistence of evil in spaces designed to nurture young minds toward productive futures. Rex began to move with purpose that suggested their quiet morning had become something else entirely, something that would demand every skill they had accumulated through years of partnership in service of families whose worst fears were about to be confirmed or challenged by evidence that existed beyond the reach of conventional investigation, but within the capabilities of a K9 whose nose remained the most sophisticated detection instrument available to those who understood that some truths could only be discovered by following scent trails that led from ordinary parking lots toward answers that someone had worked very hard to keep buried beneath layers of deception and carefully maintained innocence. The case was beginning, and somewhere in the back of Sarah's mind, she realized that true retirement would never be possible as long as families needed answers, and Rex's nose could detect the difference between truth and the lies that predators used to move through ordinary spaces disguised as helpful strangers, whose assistance became the first step toward tragedies that could still be prevented by the partnership between human determination and canine instinct that had found its way home to the work that gave meaning to mornings that might otherwise have been spent in peaceful domesticity that no longer fit their definition of purpose. Rex's tail wagged with anticipation as he led them toward whatever secrets the campus held, his amber eyes bright with the satisfaction of a working dog whose skills were once again being applied to their intended function in service of justice that sometimes required nothing more complicated than following scent trails that others had missed, scratching at ordinary objects that contained extraordinary evidence, and trusting the partnership that had survived everything retirement could offer, because some bonds transcend the boundaries of official duty to become something larger than the sum of their individual capabilities. The morning sun climbed higher as they began their search, but Sarah knew from experience that the most important discoveries often happened when least expected, in ordinary places where evil had learned to hide behind facades of normalcy that could only be penetrated by the combined efforts of human determination and canine instinct working together toward answers that families deserved, regardless of how long those answers had been buried beneath the surface of carefully constructed deceptions that some people used to turn other people's daughters into tragedy.